So I have so far covered in those lectures, and they're on YouTube. I have my own YouTube account. I started talking about different approaches to biblical study, and then proceeded to begin the history of ancient Israel. Okay, so by ancient Israel, we mean the period covered by the Old and New Testament. Okay, and so it has nothing to do with the modern state of Israel. So we covered it from the times of the patriarchs, which is in the book of Genesis from chapter 12 to the end. At the end of Genesis, that is when the 12 tribes of Israel, okay, Israel was the name given to Jacob, who was the patriarch who had 12 sons. And those 12 sons ended up in Egypt, in the area of the Nile River Delta. It's called Goshen. And there the 12 tribes lived for many years until they turned into a large group of people. Okay, it starts out as 12 sons, they become 12 tribes. The Egyptians fear having that many foreigners living in their land, so they enslave them. And they are in slavery for hundreds of years until God decides to lead them out of slavery to the land that was originally promised to the first patriarch, Abraham. Okay? So Abraham is the father of this whole group. In the 12th chapter of Genesis, God says to Abraham, you're going to become the father of many descendants. You are going to inherit this land that I'm giving you. Now, I'm going to refer to this land. It has many names. Okay, back then it was called Canaan. Geologically, it's called the Levant, and it's part of what is called the Fertile Crescent, which is an area that is well watered. It stretches from Iraq, where you have the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, all the way around and down, including Palestine. Okay, that's another name. That Palestine was the name given to this region by the Romans. We are now at a period of time. We covered the Exodus, where Moses led the people out of slavery in Egypt. They made it to the Promised Land. Okay, and under Joshua, the 12 tribes conquered a section of this piece of land. Now, if you got a map in front of you, geologically, this piece of land has a lot of diversity. In the south, it's all desert. So if you look at where Jerusalem is, if you go south of Jerusalem or from Bethlehem, that's all desert to the south, all the way down. If you look to the east, to the Dead Sea, and then you go north up to the Sea of Galilee, that is the Jordan River Valley. That is the eastern edge of the Holy Land. And then to the west, on the Mediterranean coast, you have the coastal plain, which is flat and contains some fertile land, some land that can be cultivated. Okay, all the way up to Mount Carmel, which is a mountain about 1,800 feet up, which is just above the modern city of Haifa. Okay, and this is divided up into 3 sections. The northern part is called Galilee, the middle part is called Samaria, the southern part is called Judah. Now, when the 12 tribes first entered, they were able to capture the middle part of this country. Okay, so largely to the west of the Jordan River, but not all the way to the coast. Now, that section of the land is called the hill country because it's very hilly. They're not high hills, but it's extremely hilly, and it's cultivatable land. Okay, according to archaeologists, when the Israelites got there, the 12 tribes, that land was largely vacant. So they just moved in, and many of the ancient villages have been unearthed. The way they tell the difference between an Israelite village and a village of non-Israelites, mostly, because the pottery was basically the same. But in an Israelite village, you do not find pig bones because the Israelites did not eat pork, okay? So you don't find pig bones. That's indicative of an Israelite village. Okay, and then we covered the period of the judges. So you got these 12 tribes. They divided up the land, and they each live as semi-autonomous groups. Okay, they're bound together by ethnicity and by worshiping one God, but they govern themselves autonomously. They have elders. They sort of each do their own thing. They're kind of independent. And that becomes a big problem because there's a lot of neighbors who covet the land. So when there's a military issue, or when a neighbor army invades one of the areas where a tribe is located, they need help from the other tribes to defeat, the incursion. And that story is covered in the book of Judges, because the people whom God raised up to lead the tribes to defeat those who wanted to take their land from them were referred to as judges. Okay? So the book of Judges covers all the different judges who at that time helped to defeat the enemy. Now, the most prominent enemy were the Philistines. The Philistines actually came to the Holy Land by sea. They entered by taking ships across the Mediterranean Sea. We think that they originally came from the Aegean area, which is now Greece, and they came to Palestine, and they settled along the coastal plain. So that's the reason the Israelites did not have possession of the coastal plain, because the Philistines were there. Okay, and it would be a long war between the Israelites and the Philistines before the Israelites would finally, in the end, prevail and defeat the Philistines. Okay, so what happens is that eventually they figure out that this tribal system, we call it a tribal confederacy, this tribal system isn't working out well because they are in constant danger of being defeated by some foreign invader. So they go to the prophet Samuel, and they say, Samuel, we want a king. to lead us. We want a king who can lead an army, can generate an army, and can create a kingdom, just like the other kingdoms, in the ancient world. We want to have our own kingdom, our own capital, our own place to worship, and an army that can defeat the enemies. So the first king that Samuel picks is a guy named Saul. Saul works out well for a while, but eventually Saul is defeated in a battle with the Philistines near Mount Gilboa. I'm not sure that I see that on my map, but it's kind of in the middle. It's kind of right in the middle. Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in the battle. Meanwhile, King David had raised his own mercenary army. Okay, so the tribal elders go to King David and they ask him to be their new king. So King David takes over as the second king of what we call the period of the United Monarchy. Okay, so all 12 tribes now are united by a monarchy. And the reason David is so celebrated by the Jews to this day, in fact, if you go to Jerusalem, there's a huge shrine where people go to honor King David, is because he defeated all their enemies, and by the time David was finished, the kingdom was at its largest that it had ever been. It stretched from the Negev desert in the south all the way north to what is now Syria, where you see places like Damascus and so forth. Okay, so the kingdom is rather large by the time David is finished. The other thing David does is he establishes a capital. Now, he wants a capital in neutral territory, in territory that all 12 tribes will recognize as neutral ground, so that they can all accept this as the capital city. And he picks the city of Jerusalem because Jerusalem, at the time, it was a Jebusite village, and it was surrounded on 3 sides by a deep valley, and on the other side by a high wall. So it was very well fortified and almost impossible to conquer. So what does David do? Well, the Jebusites, in order to be able to get water into their city, built a tunnel outside of the city to a water source, to a spring. And David and his army enter through that tunnel, and they get into the city, and they defeat the Jebusites internally. In other words, once they're inside Jerusalem, they defeat the Jebusites. They dispatch them rather quickly. And David proclaims Jerusalem to be the capital of the United Monarchy, and he brings the holiest object of Israel to the place where he wants to build a temple. And that object is, of course, the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? The Ark of the Covenant was a box, a golden box, with 2 angels on top and 2 poles so that it could be carried by 4 people, 2 on each side. And inside the box was the tables of the law that Moses received from God on top of Mount Sinai. All right. So there you have um, the basis of the covenant that God made with the Israelite people. In other words, they would obey God's law, and God would in turn protect and establish them in their land and make sure they lived in peace and prosperity. That was the idea. Okay, well, eventually, you probably know the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba. And after that event, his kingship starts to fall apart. One of his sons, Absalom, raises an army and tries to take the kingship away from his father. He is, of course, defeated eventually. His name was Absalom. And, but in any case, David's reign in Israel during this period of time sinks into chaos after his incident of adultery with Bathsheba. However, David has many sons, so the question on his death becomes, who's going to take over? Who's going to be the next king? Well, Bathsheba prevails on David to have the son that she bore him, a young man by the name of Solomon, to become the next king of Israel. So Solomon then becomes the third king of the united monarchy. So at this time, the 12 tribes are still united, okay? They're now on their third king, Solomon. During Solomon's reign, that is often called the golden age of ancient Israel, because Solomon inherits David's large expanse of a kingdom, and he becomes very wealthy because the land, if you look at your map, north of Jerusalem, all the way up to the city of Dan, which is north of the Sea of Galilee, that is very fertile land. And it gets approximately 25 to 30 inches of rain a year. So this area is very rich in its ability to produce various kinds of crops. Most of what they grew was grapes for wine, olives for oil, burning in their lamps, and for cooking, and wheat to make bread, barley to feed the animals, and then various kinds of fruits and vegetables, such as figs and dates and that sort of thing. Okay, so Solomon is able to tax all of this produce, and he becomes a very wealthy person, and the kingdom itself becomes quite wealthy. And Solomon uses that money to build a temple in Jerusalem. So the first temple in Jerusalem is built by Solomon, and this is in about the year 950. David ruled around the turn of the millennium, and Solomon took over, I don't know, around 970, something like that. The temple is built after he takes over. So now we have quite a wealthy kingdom, a powerful kingdom, and a kingdom that is recognized as such by its neighbors. So people leave Solomon alone. Nobody tries to invade. Nobody fights Solomon. He's a powerful king. and it's considered by Israelites to be the golden age in their history. Unfortunately, Solomon was not as wise as his reputation would suggest, because in order to build not just the temple, but Solomon builds huge military installations. He builds a palace. He builds other monuments and so forth. And in order to find the labor to do that, Solomon impresses or forces the people from the 10 northern tribes to do all the work. Okay? Now, Solomon comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin and Judah, those two tribes, lived in the south, from Jerusalem southward. The other 10 tribes were to the north. Okay? So when Solomon dies, okay, the elders of the 10 northern tribes come to Solomon's son, whose name is Rehoboam, who's going to now be the next king. And they say, Rehoboam, we will serve you as our king so long as you cease and desist the hard bondage that your father Solomon put on us. Okay, in other words, we're not interested in building your monuments anymore. We're not interested in spending our lives working for you. We have our own lives. So if you want to be king and you want us to serve you as a king, you're going to have to stop this impressed labor that your father Solomon practiced. So what does Rehoboam do? Well, he consults, he tells the 10 northern tribes, actually, it's the elders of the 10 northern tribes that came to him and told him this, gave him this ultimatum. And so Rehoboam says, well, give me 10 days. Okay, so in 10 days, he talks to two different groups of advisors. He talks to the older advisors, and the older advisors all tell him, Rehoboam, do what the northern tribes ask of you to do. If you lift the hard bondage that your father put on them, they will serve you. But if you don't, you're going to have a war on your hands. Then Rehoboam goes to the young advisors, the people his own age, okay? The people who would today be considered millennials, all right? And he asks them, what do you think I should do? And the millennials say, go back to those elders and tell them that you're going to make them work even harder than Solomon did. All right? So, well, that does it. Rehoboam, who's not the sharpest pencil in the box, listens to his young advisors, and he does what they tell him to do. And at that point, the 10 northern tribes say, well, that's fine, then we have nothing to do with the house of David. In other words, we will not acknowledge the heirs of King David as our king. We are going to pick our own king, and we are going to create our own kingdom. All right? This is around, like I say, maybe 950, 920, somewhere in there. So now we have two kingdoms. The 10 northern tribes form the kingdom to the north. And as a kind of insult to the southern tribes, which is just Judah and Benjamin, they pick the name of Israel as their kingdom. In other words, they grab the good name right away, okay? We're going to call ourselves Israel. We're the true Israel. You people in the south, you're not a part of the true Israel. You're separate. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin form their own kingdom, which of course now they can't use the name Israel, so they call it Judah. All right. So the southern kingdom is Judah, the northern kingdom is Israel. The capital of the southern kingdom is Jerusalem, and the northern kingdom doesn't have a capital yet. In fact, they don't even have a king yet. So what happens is that a guy named Jeroboam, all right, he was a general for Solomon, but he was alienated from Solomon, and he fled and he hid out in Egypt for a time. He comes back, and Jeroboam is made the king of the northern kingdom. Okay, and what he needs to do now is he needs to establish several things to turn the northern kingdom into a real kingdom. He needs to have worship sites, place where they worship. He needs to have a palace. He needs to have a capital city. He needs to have all these things. So the first thing he does is he establishes 2 worship sites. One at Bethel, which you can see is just north of Jerusalem, almost on the border between the 2 kingdoms. Bethel means house of God. The patriarch Jacob gave it that name because that's where he had his dream of the ladders going up to heaven. Okay, so he builds a worship site there, and he builds another one at a place called Dan, which is north of the Sea of Galilee. All right, so he's got worship sites at the southern end of his kingdom and at the northern end of his kingdom. And these worship sites, they're controversial because the way in which he symbolizes the presence, the northern kingdom refers to God as El, E-L, which is a name taken from the Canaanites. Their high god's name was El, okay? And El was symbolized as a golden calf, which is a fertility symbol, okay? So Jeroboam erects 2 golden calves, one at Bethel, one at Dan, all right? Now, the prophets are going to condemn this as idolatry. But most people believe that Jeroboam was trying to honor the Israelite God. He just did it in the wrong way. He picked up on the symbolism of the religion of the Canaanites, and so he made it look as if he was turning Israel into a pagan kingdom. All right, so that's basically what we covered in all of the lectures up until now. So where we're at in this story is you've got Rehoboam as the king of the southern kingdom, and you've got Jeroboam as the king of the northern kingdom. And you've still got some tension, especially with the kingdom of Aram, A-R-A-M, which is in modern-day Syria. If you see on your map, that's in modern-day Syria. Okay, so Jeroboam eventually, of course, he dies, and his son takes over. I'm looking for his name. I forget his name. But in any case, his son takes over, but he can't establish his rule. There's still conflict within the kingdom. So the commander of the army actually assassinates the rest of Jeroboam's entire family, and he takes over as the king of the northern kingdom. And his name, let's see, his name was Omri. Okay. Rehoboam to the south, he reigns for a period of, I think, 10 to 15 years. He dies. His son, Jaha, takes over. His reign lasts maybe a year. That's about it. And by the way, I should also mention that the kingdom of Judah, okay, because most of it is desert, okay, it's a very poor kingdom. Think back on the Christmas story for a minute. You see there where Bethlehem is, south of Jerusalem, okay? Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Who are the first people informed of the birth of Jesus?
Shepherds.
The shepherds. So you see, most of this land is desert. It's not cultivatable. So most of the wealth of this kingdom comes from raising livestock, sheep, goats, there's some cattle. Okay, so they've got livestock, but very little cultivatable land. So it is not a very wealthy kingdom. The kingdom to the north, on the other hand, has extremely fertile ground. The most fertile being in the valley of the Jezreel. I don't know if you can see that on your map. That's a very famous valley. There's a city that overlooks the valley called Megiddo. Okay, and from Megiddo, using the Greek name for Megiddo, you get the name Armageddon. That is the place where the final battle of Armageddon, according to the book of Revelation, was to take place. Okay. Megiddo, in fact, at the time was a military installation because the trade routes from north to south went right by Megiddo and protected the valley of the Jezreel itself. But my main point here is to make sure that everyone understands that the northern kingdom is quite wealthy. They can raise all these crops. The king can tax those crops, and he can build impressive monuments. Archaeologists have found some of the remains of what King Omri built, and it's quite impressive and amazing at places like Megiddo. And if you see on the map there, Samaria, that's what he establishes as the capital of the northern kingdom, the city of Samaria. Okay? So, now we've got these two Israelite kingdoms. And we also have Egypt to the south. Now, Egypt is still ruled by a king called a pharaoh. And depending on which document you read, the Egyptian document calls this guy I'm about to refer to as Pharaoh Shishak, whereas the Bible refers to him as Pharaoh Shishak. It's the same guy. They just got his name a little bit different. Okay. Right after these two kingdoms are established, he invades both of them. All right. First, he goes to Jerusalem and he tells King Rehoboam, to give him all the treasures of the Temple of Solomon. So King Rehoboam has to hand over all of these precious golden vessels, candelabras, menorahs, and some people believe that this Shishak got hold of the Ark of the Covenant that had, you know, the 10 tables, the 10 commandments in it, the tables of the law. So if you saw the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, that was based on that theory. You remember Indiana Jones finds finds the Ark of the Covenant in Egypt, because the idea was that Shishak took it with him after having invaded Jerusalem, okay? But he doesn't stop there. He also invades Israel. He levels a number of their cities, and then he goes back home and he writes about it. These kings love to write about how, you know, all of their military victories and how strong and powerful their armies were, and that they had 1,000 chariots and they defeated 10,000 chariots and this and that. But in any case, we do have a lot of documents as well as archaeological evidence to verify that these events did take place, that the Pharaoh invaded the two kingdoms. Okay, so I'm just going to go a little bit further and then open it up if there's any questions or comments. King Omri, who takes over the northern kingdom, actually, his reign is quite successful. But if you read the story of it in First Kings, okay, and we're talking about First Kings, probably chapters, it's past chapter 12. I'm not sure exactly what chapter it is. But the author of First Kings came from Judah. And so he considered Omri a pagan idolater. So he writes in there that King Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and blah, 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 blah. But actually, King Omri's reign was quite successful. He was able to build some impressive monuments, a city, a palace, military installations. So the northern kingdom is doing quite well. The southern kingdom is still there, but it's poor. It doesn't have the wealth that the northern kingdom has, and nor does it have the population that the northern kingdom has. Okay, you've got only 2 tribes in the south, and they're living on desert land. So, you know, they're not able to sustain a large population, whereas up north, they can sustain a fairly large population based on the fact that they can grow so much produce on the land that they have. Okay, now what I want to do is get to Omri's son before we end today. Omri's son was a guy by the name of Ahab. You remember him? Everybody remember Ahab?
Mm-hmm.
Who was Ahab's wife?
Jezebel.
Jezebel. Okay, what Ahab does is, in order to secure the kingdom, okay, they make peace with Judah, okay, so they're at peace with each other. He marries a Phoenician princess. Phoenicia is to the north, where now Lebanon is. That was Phoenicia back then. He marries a Phoenician princess named Jezebel to consecrate a treaty between Phoenicia and Israel. So now both his northern and his southern borders are at peace, okay? And eventually he even enters into a treaty with the king of Aram, or Syria, in order to protect themselves against both the expanding Assyrians to the north and the Egyptians to the south. But in any case, the story of Ahab and Jezebel is very interesting because Jezebel, coming from Phoenicia, she brings with her pagan religion, the worship of the god Baal, B-A-A-L. And she brings with her the prophets of this god. In fact, she's got 450 of them living there. And on top of that, according to this religion, the god Baal had a consort named Asherah, a female god, and she's got 400 of her prophets in Israel as well. So along comes a prophet who's born in a place called Tishbe, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, in what is now the kingdom of Jordan. And his name is Elijah, okay? And God tells Elijah that the kingdom of Israel is out of control. They're under the influence, they're totally under the influence of pagan religion. And so you've got to go correct the situation. So the prophet goes to King Ahab and he tells him, Ahab, God is going to bring a drought on Israel. And this drought is going to cause a famine until you get rid of this worship of the god Baal. Well, Jezebel is going to do no such thing. Forget it. Ahab's caught between a rock and a hard place. Most people think Ahab remained faithful to the Israelite God, but not his wife. So, so what happens is there is a 3-year drought and a famine sets in northern Israel. Okay, and that brings Ahab and Jezebel basically to their knees. So Elijah comes back and he challenges the prophets of Baal to a contest on the top of Mount Carmel. All right, you see Mount Carmel there on the map? It's that high outcrop there that I mentioned earlier, which now overlooks the Israeli city of Haifa. Okay, the contest is this. Elijah tells the prophets of Baal, slaughter as many bulls as there are prophets, put them on a pyre, and where there's wood, you know, to burn, and then call down fire from heaven to burn your sacrifice. And I will do the same, only I will call on the God Yahweh, the Israelite God, while you call on the God Baal. And whosever sacrifice is burned up will indicate who the real God is, right? You follow me so far? All right. So the prophets of Baal put all their sacrifices up there on Mount Carmel, and they dance around all day long, calling on Baal to bring down fire to burn up these sacrifices, right? Nothing happens. And Elijah is taunting them. And maybe your God is sleeping, or maybe he broke his leg, or maybe he's in bed with his consort. You know, he's just taunting them. And nothing happens, okay? So now it's Elijah's turn. Elijah prepares his sacrifice, but not only that, he pours water on it, okay, to make it even harder to burn, all right? And then he calls on the Israelite God. And a lightning bolt comes straight out of heaven and burns Elijah's sacrifice to ashes. At that point, all the people of Israel who are watching this fall to their knees and say, the Lord indeed is God. Okay, so Elijah at this point is hoping that he's going to be able to eliminate this pagan worship. But in any case, after the contest is over, he has all the prophets of Baal beheaded. And at that point, Jezebel's anger is at a high point, and Elijah flees all the way to Egypt. And he won't come back again until Jezebel, well, actually, what happens is Jezebel eventually is thrown out of a window and eaten by dogs. And King Ahab is killed as well. And a new king will take over the northern kingdom from there, and Elijah will turn over his role as a prophet to the next major prophet, which is a guy by the name of Elisha, not Elijah, or Elisha. Elisha is the way you pronounce it. Okay, so where we're stopping at this point, in the southern kingdom, things are hunky-dory, okay? There was a little-known king there who reigned for 40 years. It's peaceful. They're doing just fine. And Jerusalem is their capital. That's where they worship. The northern kingdom has gone through all this turmoil. First Jeroboam taking over, him dying, then finally Omri establishing the kingdom, then all of this mess with Jezebel and Ahab, and the building of all of these amazing monuments. And by the way, the reason Ahab has all these Phoenicians come down there is because they're doing the building projects, and he has so much wealth. He's building palaces of ivory and so forth. Later on, when we get to the prophets, you're going to see how a prophet by the name of Amos comes north and condemns the northern kingdom and those people who are lying on beds of ivory because of the injustice that is going on there, the vast difference between wealth of the wealthy and the majority of people who are poor. Okay? So that's where we'll pick it up next time. Comments or questions?